Well, it is 7 o'clock, so I think I'll kick this off. I appreciate all of you coming tonight, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Earth Care team. My name is Erica Walker, and I'm a member of the team. And tonight is the second of three of our Earth Care speaker presentations this spring. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Amy Balogh with us. The title of her presentation is called, Are We the Third Wheel? The Relationship Between God, Nature, and Humankind in the Old Testament. Before we jump into the speech, I want to say just a couple quick things about our Zoom etiquette for tonight. I'm going to mute everyone during her presentation, so that'll help improve the sound quality. And then we'll have time for questions afterward. And because of the group size, I think it's a little easier if people type in their questions. So if you do have a question for Amy, just feel free to type that in at any point. Any questions before we get going? All right. Well, I want to again welcome Amy. I want to say a quick introduction. She is the lead lecturer of the humanities at the Regis University School for Professional Advancement, and she specializes in the interpretation of the Old Testament. So again, welcome, Amy, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Erica. I'll jump right in. I'm going to be sharing a bit of presentation with you just because.
Whoops. I accidentally muted you, Amy, too. So you'll have to mute. There we are. Okay,
No,
now we're good.
Back at the beginning. Okay.
All right.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. It's always good to be with you guys. So I will share a presentation with you because I have some biblical texts that I would like you to be able to read along with. And in your screen, you should see part PowerPoint and part my little talking head. So here we go. Okay, so we should be looking good there. So as Erica mentioned, the title of my talk is Are We the Third Wheel? God, Nature, and Humankind in the Old Testament. And when Erica invited me to speak to this for this series, what was it, 2 years ago now, thanks to COVID, this was a question that I was really thinking about quite a bit because I was really bothered by a certain strain of thought in environmentalism that says that humankind is somehow unnatural, that there is something about us that is even comparable to a virus or a cancer. And I felt like, yes, there are a lot of things that we're doing wrong and a lot of things that we could be doing better, but are we really that unnatural? So I wanted to take this as an opportunity to see what the Old Testament has to say about that. As Erica mentioned, that's my specialization, so I figured why not do that and to share it with you all. So the outline of my talk, very briefly, I just want to give a few comments about how the Bible the Bible itself is shaping this project that I'm working on. And then we're going to look specifically at the relationship between nature and God and a few texts that I feel like I've chosen because I feel like they exemplify what we might consider a biblical view of God's relationship with nature. There are a lot of texts to choose from, which is a problem I ran into pretty quickly. So I've selected a few that I think will illustrate in the time that we have. These are going to be selections from the end of the book of Job and also a little bit of Psalm 104. Both of which are dedicated to this relationship. And then finally, I want to see where humankind fits into that. And because the Bible is such a human-centered text, there really is no text that's sort of free of commentary about the relationship of God to humankind. So humankind will kind of slide into our story as we look through things tonight. So to frame the question a little bit, the Bible, of course, as you are all familiar by now, is a story primarily about God's relationship to humankind. It's not terribly concerned with non-animal species, even though they, or with animal species, even though they do appear a lot in the Old Testament. It doesn't really give us a whole lot of detail about that relationship. And specifically, it's interested in the people of Israel, of course, especially in the Old Testament. And when we come into this text, we are immediately greeted with the idea that humans are created things. We are creatures created by God, along with everything else. But within this, we have a special status, and this comes out very clearly in Genesis 1, which we will look at the very end of this talk. But it's not enough that we're created things and that we're special. We also have these capacities and proclivities that the Bible says we need to manage. And you can fill in the blank there, fill in the blank with your favorite sin, I guess. There are a whole lot of things that we can do that the Bible really works to kind of shape us in various ways. And one of the items is that it gives us an ethical charge regarding our relationship to nature. If you were in on Ron Simkin's talk last week, he definitely talked about that from a Christian perspective of what it means to have the ethical charge to take care of nature that shows up so often in the Bible. And when we enter the Bible, we are also introduced to a deity who is cosmic in proportion. He has the capacity to create the world as he chooses to inhabit it. And yet at the same time, he also cares about communities and individuals. And what we're going to see in our talk tonight is that this care for communities and individuals is not just about human communities and individuals, but it's also about the natural elements. It's also about communities and individuals at a very small species level. And we'll see a lot of examples of that. So with all of this, though, the Bible does not negate the idea that God has relationships with other beings, with other creatures. And so we can even see in parts of the Old Testament that there are a lot of attestations to God's relationship to other entities. And that is exactly what we're going to focus on tonight. So I want to move away from this focus on humankind's relationship to nature. There is a ton of literature, and I bet a lot of online talks that talk about how humans are relating to nature improperly through a religious lens. So Ron gave you a bit of that last week, and hopefully tonight I will complement that with more of a focus on the relationship that nature has to God. And I think when we reflect on this relationship, we will learn even more things that can help us orient ourselves properly toward nature in a way that is more whole, that comes from a positive space. Because I think a lot of the rhetoric that's out there now is aimed at helping us feel guilty and shameful for who we are as a species. And I think the answer is really to start feeling better in a very particular way about who we are as a species. So this can kind of help us do that work to help us understand our value in the grand scheme of things, and not just as a special creation of God, but as a creation of God alongside a lot of other special creations of God. So we're going to conclude by seeing where humankind fits into this framework of God's relationship to nature. So first, looking at the relationship of nature to God, I want to start off by telling you a little bit about where we're going to go with this section. As I mentioned, all of these sections that focus on God's relationship to nature also have a human element to it that I think is very important. We sort of never get away from that human piece. And so even when we're looking at that relationship specifically, there's always this human bit in the background. And what we're going to find looking at this question in the Old Testament is that, yes, God does have a robust relationship with humankind and with the individuals that seek him. But he also has a robust relationship with other species and with nature as a whole. And sometimes in the biblical texts, sometimes that takes precedent over his relationship to humankind. So that's what I'm going to jump into with the book of Job. And we're going to look at just a few selections out of the last 4 chapters. So chapters 38 through 42 are the conclusion to the book. As most of you are well aware, the book of Job begins with a man who is suffering greatly, unbelievable amounts of suffering. And the vast majority of the book is a conversation between Job and his friends over essentially the question of what did Job do wrong, or who is God that he could let this happen. And so it really is like a suffering servant type of piece of literature. And throughout this, Job is begging God for a response. Job wants to be able to state his case before God the way that a lawyer would before a court. And he wants to kind of hear from God why this is happening to him, because he feels like he hasn't done anything wrong. And perhaps that's true. The book kind of leaves us with a question mark about that. And this question mark comes because of how God answers Job. And it's interesting that God does not go after, he doesn't try to rebuttal Job's arguments. What he does is he appeals to his own role as the creator of the universe. And Job's role as a tiny little bit of creation. He's one member of one species on this planet, and he seems to have forgotten that. So this is God's reminder, and it's very tough. By this point, it's very clear from the introduction that God is quite angry with Job. So we kind of skipped that part, but we're going to jump in right here in 38, verse 4. So this is again God speaking. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So essentially what God is telling Job is, well, he's of course proclaiming his status as creator, but he's going into details of things that we could never know. And he's asking Job, do you know these things? And of course, Job's proper answer, if he were to respond verbally, would be no, I absolutely do not know these things. But in explaining his relationship to nature, God talks about how highly involved he was in the entire process and continually is, which is something that we'll see in a moment. We tend to think of the creation stories of the Bible as being the version that appears in Genesis 1, where God almost kind of sits back and speaks things into existence. He's very hands-off in that particular story. But here we have a very different perspective on the role of God in creation. Here, he is the one who measures the foundation of the earth. And who not just determines its measurements, but who also makes sure that it's correct when it's done by stretching the measuring line over it. He is the one who laid its cornerstone. And of course, he's asking Job, like, were you there? Do you even know where the cornerstone is? Do you know where I even started this project of creation? Because I do. And so he's very much highlighting this fact that he was involved in every little rock that was placed, right? Like every little stone is there because he put it there and he designed it and he measured it and made sure it was all just so. And in the meantime, while he's doing this work, the stars are singing, the angels, the sons of God, the angels are also singing in chorus. And so it's this really like vivid image of not just God creating, but there's like this huge party that's happening while he's doing it because it's just such a good thing. And so again, he moves on from there, speaking to Job. Who shut the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. So again, he's continuing this language of God's control over things, even saying like, look, I'm the one who locked the sea so it can't come any further than I tell it to. And what I really like about this passage is that God talks to the sea and it understands. And this brings us into a thread that I'm going to be kind of picking at for the next few minutes, is that there's also this idea that God speaks the language of nature, and that also nature speaks the language of God. So there is communication that happens between them. It's not just that it's this inanimate thing that he controls, or he sets a limit and then walks away from it. He is consistently involved in communicating with nature and making sure that everything is running properly. So jumping down to chapter 38, verse 39, we start getting into away from the natural elements and into specific animal species. So here we begin with the lion. The lion was the most powerful carnivore in ancient Israel. So it becomes really this emblem of certain things, an emblem of power being the first one of those. The female is an emblem of powerful women. And so we have a lot of weight to this imagery whenever you see the imagery of a lion. But here, God is very particular about his relationship to this species. And he says, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their thicket? Who provides for the raven, its prey, when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? And what I really like this verse because it's not enough, again, going back to kind of that Genesis 1 idea that we get, that God maybe kind of speaks things into existence and then it runs itself. Here, God is intimately involved in the life of even the most powerful and capable of species. He is the one who hunts prey for the lion. It's not like you made the lion so great and now the lion goes and does its thing. It's that God is deeply involved in every meal that they have is provided by him in some way or another. Same for the raven. Again, here we have that idea of nature and God being able to communicate with each other. That the chicks, from the time they're hatched and when they're still reliant on their mother, they know how to cry to God, and that's who they're crying to. So we've moved from the natural elements and their relationship to God to particular species and their relationship with God in terms of food. And then the author moves into talk about reproduction of animals and the maintenance of their herds. And again, I'm kind of jumping around. These are just selections. And if you were to read these on your own, and I definitely encourage you to, you would find that there's just example of exactly what I'm saying. That for about 4 chapters, God goes off on Job in this manner to just explain to him how little he actually knows about the way things work. And that it really is kind of none of his business in Job's situation. So Job 39, 1-4, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bring forth their offspring and are delivered of their young. Their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them. So this one is, again, focusing on reproduction, focusing on the maintenance of a population. It doesn't necessarily say that he's making sure it all works well, right? But we do know that he is keeping an eye on things, that he's observing them. He knows exactly how long it takes. He knows when they're going to deliver, and he's there. He's part of that experience. And, it's presumably because of God's design, right, that these are able to grow up and go out and be independent creatures. So again, we have his involvement in all aspects of the life of species. So with that, we're going to start segueing into our talk more about humankind. Psalm 104 is a good bridge piece, I think, to look at the relationship of nature to God with a bit of a human element kind of peeking in. So that's what we're going to do next. And I am also going to just give a section of this. So again, I would encourage you to go read the entire psalm, which is quite a bit longer than what we're doing here. But this at least gives you a new perspective for reading this kind of text, right? And again, you'll find these kind of texts all over the Old Testament. Once you start looking, you'll now have new lenses to see all sorts of things that you probably didn't see before. So looking at Psalm 104, just 19-31. He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness and it is night, when all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. So I'm just going to pause there. That's the first section I want to look at. So here we have something similar to what we saw in Job, but kind of without the frustration on God's part. This is the psalmist, writing a praise to God. We have God making the moon, the sun, darkness and night. So that kind of echoes a bit of the creation language that you are probably already familiar with. In the beasts creeping about in the forest at night. Again, we have our lions roaring for their prey, seeking food from God. So this highlights, the example in Job highlighted how God relates to nature. But here we're seeing how nature is relating to God as well, that the lions are seeking food from God. They understand that they are dependent on God in a certain way. And then when the sun, and that is kind of the work that they do, is hunting. And then when the sun rises, they go lie down in their dens. And I bring this text out, again, we of course have a lot of sort of repetition of ideas with Job, but what is different here is what comes next in verse 23. Because here we see man, humankind, sandwiched between the lions and the Lord. And I think that's on purpose. So we have, the lions going out for their prey, seeking food from God, and then coming in and resting in their dens. And then in verse 23, we have man going out to work and to his labor until the evening. So we have this almost mirror image, right? That like lions go do their thing and they come home and rest, and so does mankind. The psalmist puts mankind in this psalm about how great nature is. And it took me a while to kind of figure out why. And I think it's because the psalmist is seeing humankind as part of nature, that we are one species that is worthy of mention in talking about the goodness of God's creation. And not just our species, but the work that our species does is an important part of God's creation. Just as it's important that the lion hunts its prey and all of the good things that that does for an ecosystem, just as important as it is that there's darkness and night so that animals can go about their nocturnal business, just as the moon and the sun do what they do, so it's important that humankind goes about its work. I don't know if this was covered in the prior week, but most people in ancient Israel were agrarian or agricultural workers. So for them, work was very much tied to the land. It was tied to farming, it was tied to cultivating, and definitely not the kind of monoculture stuff that we have now. Very much hand to mouth kind of existence, and very much year to year kind of existence. So you had that aspect of life that most of us just don't have now. Most of us aren't managing herds of animals, or we might garden, but we can also just go to the grocery store and get what we need if our crops don't come in. So people really saw themselves as part of nature, and what they were doing was natural work, and that's part of the created order that God set forth. And then this section at least concludes with the Lord. How manifold are your works? So again, we have the work of the lion, the work of man, and then the work of God, kind of escalating the subject. And of course, in wisdom, you've made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships, and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. So here it's almost a repetition of that same idea. We have this big sea, all of the creatures in it, and we have humankind in our little ships, floating around on the Mediterranean and doing the things that humans do when they're seafaring. And we also have Leviathan, who is sort of a mythological sea monster that shows up in several places in the Bible. and the vision of God playing, in this sea with this monster and all of its creatures and the ships as well. So we very much have humankind and human activity as part of the natural order of things. And here we have close to the conclusion of the psalm, it says, "These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works." And so on and so on. It goes on praising God for several more verses. The main thing that I want to look at here, there are two main things that I want to look at. So the first is this first verse, verse 27. Before this, we listed a lot of things, everything from the sun and moon to sea creatures, great and small, and everything kind of in between. But to say, "These all look to you to give them their food in due season," highlights the ongoing reciprocal relationship between God and all of creation. It's not just that humans look to God for food, which is an idea that's very explicit in parts of the Old Testament. It's not just that other species look to God for food and nourishment, like we saw with the lions and the ravens and the goats, but everything. The sun looks to God for energy. The moon looks to God for what it needs. And he gives it to them. But sometimes you can see in verse 29, sometimes he doesn't. And that in this particular text seems to be somewhat by design, that things naturally are going to die and return to dust. Which brings us to my second point, and that is the use of creation language in this psalm. The talk about returning to dust. If you're familiar with Genesis 2, that is where God breathes life into dirt and humankind emerges from there. This talk about when you send forth your spirit, all of these things are created and you renew the face of the ground. The face of the ground is talked about in Genesis 2 as a place that God has to water with mist before he can create vegetation and humankind. So there's this rich language here drawing us back and forth between these creation stories and explaining to us that creation is almost a continual thing, I think is what the author is trying to say. Because verse 30, when he talks about you send forth your spirit, they are created and you renew. This is not in the past. This is written in the present. So God is continuously involved in the created order. And that is really where the psalmist concludes. And from there, he says, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May we rejoice, and kind of all those classical praise phrases that you might expect. So that is kind of the picture that I want to paint for God's relationship with nature. You have them being able to communicate with each other, speaking each other's languages. You have nature knowing that it depends on God, not just animals, things that we might consider beings to have a sense of consciousness, but also even the natural elements themselves have to listen to God in a certain way. And where do we fit into that? It depends on which author you ask. If you ask the author of Job, when God is angry with Job and frustrated, then it doesn't seem that Job really fits very well into God's relationship with nature, because Job is so concerned about himself, right? He's concerned about his own life and his own problems, and he doesn't even think about God's other things that he has going on. The psalmist has a different perspective. For the psalmist, humankind is very much a creature in nature that is working and doing natural things, and that is to be part of the reason why we are to praise God. So now I want to move fully into where humankind fits, because that is going to be the most explicit in Genesis 1. And you will find these ideas, of course, echoed in other texts as well. So it's not just that I'm kind of picking here, it's just that I picked something that I feel is representative of the Old Testament view, if there is such a unified thing. So you're probably very familiar with this text. It's the classical 7 days of creation where God creates for 6 days and rests on the seventh. So here I just have a brief chart as a bit of a refresher. So on day 1, God creates light and dark. Day 2, sky and water. And day 3, he kind of brings the waters together into what we would call a planet. And out of that, land emerges in all of its vegetation. Day 4, God creates the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and stars, to mark the time. So it's really the creation of time. Day 5 is dedicated to water creatures and birds. Day 6 is, most people don't realize that this is actually split. We get all of the earth creatures first, and then humankind comes last. And then we often forget to continue reading the story and to find that God also has a day of rest on day 7. In my experience teaching this text, Genesis 1, and I've taught it in a lot of different contexts, it's pretty interesting to watch people read it and to watch their faces as I read it, because I get this very strong sense that people are just mostly waiting to get to the good part when you read it. And that is the part where God creates humankind. The first 26 verses can be, to modern sentiments, they can be quite boring because they're very repetitious. There's a melody to them if you speak them aloud that is almost like lulling you to sleep, depending on how your energy is that day. And our modern audience generally doesn't like repetition. They generally don't like that sort of art form that would be like oral tradition in the ancient world, and where you would expect repetition and things like that, because that's how you would tell stories and make things memorable. But in the modern audience, we tend to kind of zoom past the first 5 days and to focus on the humankind. And that's actually exactly what we're going to do today, but in a very different spirit. So hopefully you can bear with me on that. Some of the things that I want to pull out before we look at the human piece is that there is no talk in the first 5.5 days about this creation all being for humankind. Yes, humankind is going to have a special position within the creation, but it's not, the story isn't told as if this is all for humankind and for enabling us to live as a species. In fact, it's quite the opposite. With every day that God creates, he looks back on what he did that day and declares that it is good. It is full, it is sufficient. That word good can mean a lot of things. It can mean morally good, it can mean good in quality, but ultimately what he's saying is that's it, that's whole, like that's what it is. It's not that the plants and land and vegetation are good because humankind is going to need that. It's not that the sun, moon, stars, and time itself is good because humankind is going to need time. It's good because it's good. It's good because God created it and he has a relationship with it, and that's the end of that. And then he moves on to the next thing. So when we get to humankind, and a lot of people, when they interpret it in the 21st century, are going to interpret certain things about this quite wrong. I mentioned the idea that humankind is kind of the point of the story. Humankind is not necessarily the point of the story. It has a lot to say about who we are and what our role is in this creation, but ultimately the whole story is not about us. The story is about where we fit in the natural order and how God relates to all of us, meaning all of us species and natural wonders. So I'm going to go ahead and read these verses here. So this starts in verse 26 of Genesis 1. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So I'll pause here for a second. We'll leave the first part for now because that's going to be repeated below. But what's important for understanding our place and our special position is that we are created in the image of God. Now, commentators have debated for centuries, probably even millennia, about what exactly that means. Now that we have modern psychology and sort of neurobiology and all that stuff, a lot of people think that this is maybe consciousness. Some people have argued that it's our ethical sense. So kind of pick what you will, but the point is that there's something about us that is reflective of God. And our interpretation of what that means is going to become very important in this question of our relationship to the earth. Because if you believe that God is creating humankind in his image, what you believe about God is going to inform what you believe about yourself. So, and what you believe about yourself is going to reflect what you believe about God. So that is something that we're going to keep with here in a moment. So verse 28, God blessed them and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on earth." So we've done really well with the first half of this. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. As some of you probably know, by the year 2050, we're supposed to have about 9 billion to 10 billion people on this planet. Right now, we're at about 7.5. So we're moving along pretty quickly. We've figured out how to reproduce, how to be fruitful and fill the earth, to the point where we now have to have conferences about how to rein it in a little bit more, and to make do with what we have. So that part we can put a big check mark next to. Humans have accomplished that. The part that's a little more dicey is the imperative to subdue and have dominion over all of these species. Now, I would like to be able to tell you that the translations subdue and dominion are too harsh and that there's like a softer word that we can use that's more gentle, right? But that's not true. These are actually the appropriate translations to use and probably the most appropriate of our translation options. But the question it's going to bring up is going to relate back to my comment about being made in the image of God. And that's, what does it mean to subdue and have dominion for a creature that is in the image of God? Is it that we are a tyrant? And is God a tyrant then? That we are to lord it over creation and to do all of the negative things that we are prone to do? Is it an excuse for us to, we have the fish mentioned here. Is it an excuse to overfish? Is it an excuse to push certain birds to extinction? Is it an excuse to dominate every living thing that moves on Earth to the point where they are no longer what they used to be? Which is the case of how a lot of our cattle are treated. And so this brings up a huge ethical question, because you can read it in a bunch of different ways. You can read it as a tyrant. And certainly there are people out there, even well-meaning Christians, who firmly believe that this verse gives them license to use creation as they will without repercussion. The question is, do you want to do that? Is that what it means to be created in the image of God for you? Does God act that way in your belief system? Or is God a good king and therefore we are good subduers and dominators? Do we rule like a good king with the ethics and the soft-handedness and the kindness that people and other species in this case often need? What kind of ruler are we going to be is the question that's being asked here. And whatever it is we're supposed to do it in connection with our reflection of God. So this is going to be kind of the last slide before my conclusion. As you can probably gather, most folks tend to stop reading at verse 28. We have this great blessing to go have lots of kids, to consume lots of things, if that's how we want to interpret this. And that's like good enough for me. So I'm going to like move on past the next few verses. But I think it's crucial to stick with the story here, because if there's one thing the Bible does well, it's that it puts its ideas into story format, and makes itself memorable so that you can convey these things much more easily than you could otherwise. It's much better to read a story that teaches an important idea than it is to kind of iterate that idea in like a some kind of lecture format or something like that. So it's important to stick with the end here. And again, this chapter in Genesis, it has a lot of sort of ideological components. So far we've already begun to see its basic ideas about humankind ought to be operating. And here we have an even stronger example of how humankind ought to be operating. But again, it's not explaining itself to us. We kind of have to sit with it for a moment. So verse 29, and God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. That's a very peculiar thing to say. We've just been given all of creation, all of the species to subdue and to have dominion over. So to some people, that might equal a buffet, right? I mean, that means that you can have whatever. But God says, okay, let's peel that back a little bit. Let's take that back a little bit. And he says, here's what I mean by subduing and having dominion properly. I have given you, as food, I have given you grass, and I've given you tree fruit. That is literally impossible for humans. I looked it up several times because I kind of had to make sure that I could make this claim. That's not a possible diet for us. So in that case, what is the Bible trying to teach us, if this isn't something to be taken literally? And there are people who have tried, by the way. If you Google the Hallelujah diet, you will find that there is actually a whole diet based on this, but it seems like nobody can stay on it for more than a few weeks. But the idea, I think, is happening is that to dominate and subdue well means not taking any life. And in fact, it means only taking life that actually thrives on being taken. So when you think of a fruit tree, that fruit is eventually going to fall to make way for the new season, for the new crop that's going to come in. And it would be actually a waste to not eat that fruit. Same with grass. You know how your grass grows faster as soon as you cut it? That is actually quite true, because grass can only get to a certain length. So in order for your grass to grow, you actually need to cut it down. So it actually helps these plants for humans or for anyone to take part of them, to graze, to eat the fruit. So what is happening here is that the image painted for how we are to do what we do is that we are to only do things that enhance the well-being of nature. And in that, to not take from her. And what is neat about this is not just that idea, is that in the following verse, nature follows suit. Nature follows this example that we set before it. Verse 30, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird that creeps on the earth, or to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. So here, God even says that the animals will do this as well. So the vision, again, this is, once upon a time, this is in a situation that we no longer live in. The grand vision for how humankind fits was that we were actually envisioned to be quite small in our footprint, to use kind of a modern term that we like to use. Yes, we have a special place. Yes, we are royalty on earth, meant to do all of these great things. But at the same time, we are meant to do them in a very particular way that is very mindful about the impact that we have and whether we cause things to flourish or whether we cause damage. And it's within our power to do that, is the message that we're getting here. And then finally, we wrap up the story. God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. And then on the seventh day, God has a Sabbath and takes rest. So we've worked a lot with this relationship. I know we're coming up on time, so I have a conclusion next. And I think it's interesting to see, like, not only does God have this robust relationship with nature that we've seen all of this past 40 minutes or so, but humankind can take part in that robust relationship, and humankind is actually meant to take part in that. And the same way that God cares for all of the species and maintains their well-being, if we are in the image of God truly, then that is how we will be as well. And it takes work. It takes discipline. The Bible is clear about that, where it's clear about that. It takes, again, with the grass and fruit thing, it takes setting boundaries for ourselves and sticking to that and trusting that nature is going to reciprocate and follow suit. It's also noteworthy that God doesn't just relate to humankind and nature, but he also relates to himself. God takes a day off after the work of creation to kind of do whatever it is he does on his day off, and to have that relationship with himself. That's also an important aspect of who God is that I think could help with this question of how are we to, as modern folks, to live in nature. That if we emulate God, the relationship we have with ourselves is also very important. And that's something that I don't think we talk enough about when we're talking about in the environment. If you don't have a positive relationship with yourself as a creature, as a limited being, as a creation of God, then you're not going to relate to the rest of nature that way either. So just a quick conclusion to the question, so are we the third wheel? The answer is both yes and no. It depends on how we act in the world. So the answer is yes, if we continue to be like Job and insisting that our relationship with God is the only one that matters to him. The answer is going to be yes, if we continue to view ourselves as more important than the other elements and species that God loves. And the answer will continue to be yes, if we continue to subdue and dominate as a tyrant, rather than a humble king whose power was given by a source much greater. But the answer could also be no, if we acknowledge and participate in the relationship that God has with nature, that is a very meaningful relationship for all of the parties involved. We could also answer this question no, if we acknowledge our proper place as one species among the millions that we now know of that God cares about. And that pool is getting bigger every day as we discover more and more species. And the answer could also be no, if we step into our responsibility to use our special status within the proper limits and to the benefit of all species. So basically my answer is that it's up to us if we're going to be what some hard environmentalists call a virus or a cancer to the planet. Or we could also be part of the solution of undoing the things that we've done and doing our best to conserve and preserve what we do have left, and to promote flourishing like in the way that we should be, in the way that we were designed to be. So that's what I leave you with. I know we're over time, so thank you for your patience, and I will leave it to Erica to take over the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. I think we are a small enough group that it will work fine if people want to ask their questions directly. So does anyone have a question for Amy right now? If you do, just unmute and ask away.
They also type them if they wanted
Well, I have a question. I'll kick off while people are pondering. What do you, I'm curious, what do you see the role of the Bible having been historically that has brought us to the point where we are environmentally and facing the challenges that we have? And then also, what do you see the role of the Bible going forward as we work to resolve some of these problems?
That's a good question because there's been a string of arguments, I think starting in the 60s. I forget the author's name, but there was a famous article that was published basically blaming the Bible for putting us on this trajectory where humankind is kind of run amok. And I think a lot of that, some of that's true. There are definitely brands of Christianity that use our special status as a way to lord it over and to use it to deplete resources. I recently, in one of my classes, I had to have a conversation with a fundamentalist student who literally was reading mentions in the book of Revelation of a new heaven and a new earth as meaning that the earth is basically a throwaway planet. Because God is going to, at some point, recreate the whole thing and it's all going to be good. So it doesn't matter what we do now. And I had to remind her that, that's poetry. That is a certain genre called apocalyptic text that uses a lot of big metaphors to talk about spiritual things. And probably no one in antiquity meant that literally. So I think we hopefully are coming into a more educated view of what the Bible is and how to interpret it properly. Because a lot of folks, pick and choose what they want to hear, right? And it's been said that you can use the Bible to argue basically anything you want, even contradictory points. And you definitely see that in the environmental talk, both pro and con. Genesis 1 plays big into that because it does have that language of dominion and subjugation. That hardly anyone asks the question of like, well, what does it mean to be, what kind of ruler do you want to be? So I think the Bible has, people reading the Bible have used it to do some damage, but we can also read it differently to do some good. And that's where I think we're trying to lean.
Amy, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And I appreciate particularly that background through the Old Testament of those, I think especially through the Psalm of sort of hearing that language that is sort of Old Testament version of ecological systems, and the first encounter that there are systems we live in, including life and death being a system. So I appreciate that. And then to your very last point on the yes and no chart, that know if we know how to stay within those, I think, barriers or boundaries or limits you referenced. And so what I'm curious about is, it seems like as soon as humanity steps out of that system role, in the very first time humanity took resources and created something with it, built a hammer, and then built a house, and then stored water, and then whatever, that we were steadily off track. So is the boundary that we should go back to being basically no different than the deer and sort of live at that level? Or, is that sort of inherently, although biblically maybe grounded, is kind of impractical? And so where is the boundary, and how do we know when we've crossed the boundary and how to anchor ourselves in that?
Well, and that's a great question because there's often the trap of kind of falling into a romantic notion of what the past was, right? Mm-hmm. Going back to sort of hunter-gatherer kind of existence, and right. We can't do that anymore. It's kind of too late for that. There are too many of us. There's too little of them, right? There aren't a whole lot of deer walking around on the concrete these days. So it's not necessarily something that we can go back to. So what we have to figure out next is, where do we go? Like, how do we rein it in? What are the areas that we can cut? What are some of the major things that are really wasteful? I think two of the big issues that come up a lot are, obviously carbon emissions, which I'm sure Ron talked about last week, but also garbage. So if we could solve those two things, we would be making huge strides toward a new era, right? And we have so many people on the planet that we can't live an agrarian lifestyle anymore because we don't have the literal acreage to do it. So yeah, it's a good question. It's something that we have to figure out. And looking back, there's no kind of magical moment where things go off the rails. Like, it really is a slow progression. And a lot of people would say really the Industrial Revolution kind of kicked things up a big time. Obviously, before then, we didn't have industry. We didn't have all of these pollutants. We didn't have plastics until, I remember glass bottles of soda and having to return them at the grocery store. So it hasn't actually been that long that we've made this mess. And when you look at the history of human population, it really goes up in the 1800s. So there's something that's quite recent about what's happening that wasn't really a big issue back in the day. So we have to kind of figure out where that line is, what we can give up within reason. And there are some kind of big things that if we were to solve it, it would go a long way. But I don't recommend running around like the deer. So.
Any other questions for Amy? Barbara, I think you're muted still.
In other traditions, there are creation stories. Are many of them similar to our Christian Bible story of creation?
There are so many, it's hard to compare. The ones that I know of are mostly from the ancient world, so some of Israel's neighbors. And a lot of them are much more harsh. A lot of them, humankind is not given the dignity that the Bible gives us. Most of the ancient stories talk about humans basically as doing the drudge work of the gods, the work that gods don't want to do, like cleaning out canals and kind of seeding the fields and all of this thing that we might consider hard labor. And so that's where the Bible is really rare. And there's a lot of scholarship that's been done comparing the stories of the Bible to these other ancient stories and showing that one of the things that's unique to Israel is the idea that humankind is special, that humankind does have a special something over the animals, and that God's relationship is loving, that it's not just him using us to do some things, but that he actually cares deeply about us. You don't get that emotional quality from the other ancient stories. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know much about the Eastern traditions though, like Hinduism and those. I don't know much about their stories.
All right, I think we have time for one more, if there is one more. All right. I don't see any other takers. So again, Amy, thank you so much. Really enjoyed your presentation. I think you've given us quite a bit to think about. It's hard to applaud over Zoom, but we can do it. And thanks to all of you for coming this week. Next Thursday night, we have our last presentation, which will be Jane Vennard. So I encourage you all to come back. Here's Jane is on our screen here tonight. I encourage you all to come back next week. So again, thank you all for coming. Have a great week, and I hope to see many of you all next week as well. Bye-bye.